I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now? I bet you can, can't you? All right, let's try that one more time. Professor Horne, can you hear me now?
Yes, 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 yes.
All righty. All righty. So I saw over in the comments, they said, Tanya over there cooking, but we can't hear her. Real briefly, I'm going to start one more time, real brief. You're tuned into Rootwork on the Black Liberation Media platform. This is Thandisizwe Chimurenga. Please like, subscribe, and share this video. Subscribe to Black Liberation Media here on YouTube. Subscribe to my Rootwork channel on YouTube, and subscribe to the Patreon. That's the short version. As I was saying, we're here today to talk with Professor Gerald Horne and his newest work, Armed Struggle, Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and 70s. Dr. Horne is the Moores Professor of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He is the author of more than 30 books. I'm not going to give his whole resume because we will be here all day, and I only want to talk about this particular book at the moment, Armed Struggle. Apologies profusely, as usual. Thank you so much, Professor Horne, for being on the show today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, Lord have mercy. Okay, I don't understand what that was about, but I kind of understand what that was about. So your latest book, again, it's Armed Struggle, ? Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and 70s, published by international publishers. Because of, in the interest of time, we're just going to go through it, okay? So this most recent book, it's more than 650 pages. And as you say, it contains not just thousands of footnotes, but also your analysis based on your experiences in community with Panthers and Communists. For those who have not yet read this book, or for those who may feel intimidated by the more than 600 pages and thousands of footnotes, what is the central message, the easily digestible morsel that you want to give people?
Well, there are a number of messages. First of all, I'm trying to reframe the discourse on Black power. That is to say, the contemporary understanding oftentimes groups the Black Panther Party, at least the iteration that arose in Oakland, Berkeley in 1966, with their antagonists. Not to mention the fact that at the time, this concept of Black power was being enunciated in the Black Panther newspaper. There were critiques of that concept. The Black Panther Party, as I tell the story, was a kind of halfway house between a form of Black nationalism and the struggle for socialism. That is to say that the leaders of the Panther Party, including Huey P. Newton of Oakland, admitted to being influenced by Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, Paul Robeson, et al. And that is not necessarily the case for many with whom they are grouped in this concept of Black power. I'm also trying to draw critical distinctions between and amongst armed propaganda, armed self-defense, and armed struggle. Armed propaganda being what happened in Sacramento, May 1967, when the newly minted Panthers marched into the Legislative Assembly armed in order to protest against pending legislation. Armed self-defense taking place, for example, in December 1969 at the Panther headquarters in Los Angeles, where they came under assault by the LAPD and fought back. And then armed struggle, what unfolds at the Marin County Courthouse in August 1970, when the precocious teenager Jonathan Jackson, with roots in Pasadena, led an armed assault on the Marin County Courthouse. Depending upon which source you believe, it was either to help to free his imprisoned brother, George Jackson, or alternatively to get to a radio station where there could be broadcasts about the torturous conditions inflicted upon prisoners. Those are just a few of the messages that I'm seeking to convey in this book, not to mention the fact that even though my role is not profound with regard to these events that I describe, the fact of the matter is that I knew a number of the principles and was present at a number of key moments. For example, the summer 1969 conference in Oakland, Berkeley, the anti-fascist conference where the Panthers basically assumed leadership of the entire US left in putting forward this idea of anti-fascism.
So you want to interrogate the lumping of Panthers in with other organizations regarding the Black Power movement in terms of drawing out the distinctions, specifically ideologically, of where the Panthers stood.
That is precisely what I said.
Yeah, I mean, I can understand and appreciate that, but I'm wondering if this is a separating other organizations from the Black Power movement. Not necessarily.
Well, you know more than most that, as that poster behind you suggests, you collaborated with a book with Deborah Jones, which deals with her encounter with the US organization headquartered in Los Angeles. As you therefore know more than most, there were sharp ideological cleavages and conflicts between and amongst the US organization on the one hand and the Panthers on the other. But as I articulated a moment or two ago, today, a blanket is thrown over the two, and they are seen by some as indistinguishable. And I dare say that there are those who are still in the land of the living who would take exception and objection to that categorizing.
I understand. Absolutely. Now, sort of on this topic of cleavages, on the topic of cleavages, but not necessarily on the topic of the Black Power movement, you also state that the topic of armed struggle in this book is highlighted, but it's a framing device that serves to illuminate still regnant ideological cleavages.
That is correct. I do not want to give the impression that every page and every sentence deals with the question of armed struggle. But what I am trying to illuminate is why, for example, as the book begins, in 1971, you had Panthers in Algiers, Algeria, meeting with diplomats from then socialist Czechoslovakia about getting arms for a struggle. What would lead the Panthers to try to get arms? As I also mentioned in those opening sentences, the Panthers were also known to receive arms from comrades in Vietnam who had a legation in Algeria. It's also a fact that the Panthers sent frequent delegations to the headquarters of the real and imagined foes of US imperialism. That is to say, to North Korea, to Moscow, to Hanoi, etc. Not to mention to the nation then known as the People's Republic of Congo, that is to say Congo Brazzaville, as opposed to the larger Congo across the Congo River. So this idea of armed struggle, once again, it's just a framing device. It's an attempt to seek to, for example, depict conditions, horrendous conditions that might have led people to want to pick up the gun. I mean, for example, a repetitive theme in this book is arson being inflicted upon Black families in Southern California, which is, to put it euphemistically, a kind of aggressive gentrification. This is a topic that has not been ventilated thoroughly, to put it mildly. On the other hand, a topic that is still a matter of constant discussion is the question of the LAPD, police terror, shooting first, asking questions later. I suggest that that kind of reign of terror also was a rationale and a reason for those seeking to engage the question not only of armed self-defense and armed propaganda, but armed struggle.
So one of the things you do in this book is you talk about the conditions of California that gave rise to this phenomenon, and partly why you decided to focus. And I understand that this is part of the work you've done in previous books regarding Los Angeles, etc. I wanted to ask you about the place of Southern California and Mexico in particular. You talked about the vast geography of the Southern California area, the manufacturing and fashion apparel industry, automobiles, and Hollywood as a manufacturing center with its product of make-believe. So the financial resources of a Hollywood would be very attractive as a funding source for radical groups. You also talk about the proximity of Mexico, and I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit. I remember I used to hear about this film called Sweet Sweetback's Badass Song, and it was spoken about in glowing terms. And once I first saw the film, I was like, oh my God, what am I watching? It wasn't until Mario Van Peebles, son of Melvin Van Peebles, did the film Sweetback, giving the historical context of Sweetback, that I understood it. But in the film, you have this person, sex worker, etc., shoots a cop, goes on the run, and eventually he goes to Mexico, where he basically he escapes to Mexico. And at the time, the Panthers were talking about the film was a victory. But that place of Mexico in the Black liberation movement, in its place in Southern California, can you talk a little bit about that more?
Well, first of all, you may know that of late I published a book dealing with the history of Texas, which, like Southern California, also borders. However, Texas was a site for one of the largest populations of the enslaved under the US flag. And thousands upon thousands of enslaved Africans escaped to freedom in Mexico. With regard to Southern California, one of the points I try to put forward is that this southern neighbor had a kind of civilizing effect on Southland. What I mean to suggest by that is that oftentimes the white supremacists, for example, in the border towns like San Diego, for example, would seek to export the peculiar folkway that was Jim Crow to Baja California, for example, which was against the law. And then they would be instructed that this was against the law. Also, as the story evolves and as history has evolved, you see that just like during times of slavery, you had a lot of intercourse in the 20th century between Black radicals and Black progressives in the Southland and in California generally, and their comrades and peers across the border. Mexico is part of a larger story of Black internationalism, flagged by the opening sentences, once again, of this book, where I talk about the Panthers' relationship to Algeria, for example, and Vietnam and Congo-Brazzaville. I should also say that this book deals with more than the Panthers, as the title suggests. It also deals with the Communist Party of the Southland, which at one time was one of the strongest units within that organization before the disruption of COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program, which of course also afflicted the Panthers, and the trials of 1951, 1952, criminal trials, which sought to not only put Communist Party leaders behind bars, but also in some ways to legalize the struggle for socialism, for example. This book also deals with liberals, the NAACP, the oldest and largest civil rights organization in the United States, as it's often described, founded in 1909, not least by W.E.B. Du Bois. But as many in your audience may know, during the era of the Red Scare and the Cold War, the NAACP decided to turn on those with whom they previously had been collaborating with and became vigorous proponents of anti-communism, for example. And ultimately, they also turned against the Panthers. Also, they turned against Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam, for example. They turned against Dr. King. They were fighting a multi-front war, for example. But I guess their leaders would say, at the end of the day, they survived, and some of those against whom they had turned did not survive.
That's unfortunate. Let me go back. So we talked about, well, the question I asked was about the place of Mexico in the Black liberation struggle. When you talk about the conditions that gave rise here in Southern California, you also stated that colleges had a role to play. Can you elaborate on that for our audience?
Well, sure. With regard to colleges, under former and late Governor Pat Brown, particularly in the 1950s and early 1960s, there was a massive effort to construct universities and colleges, universities like the campus at La Jolla, due south of where you're sitting, the campus at Santa Barbara, due north of where you're sitting, not to mention junior colleges like Laney and Merritt College, which gave rise to student activists like Bobby Seale and Huey P. Newton. And so colleges were a recruiting ground for the Panthers. Likewise, the military was a recruiting ground for the Panthers. Recall that during the era we're discussing, the United States was in a shooting war. It was in a shooting war during the early stages of the Red Scare on the Korean Peninsula, which came to afflict the Communist Party. And by the time of the rise of the Black Panther Party, or at least the iteration that I'm discussing of the Black Panther Party, there was a war in Indochina, in Vietnam. The Panthers collaborated fruitfully with Black GIs, as they were called, Black soldiers. And in fact, that was particularly the case with regard to Camp Pendleton, due south of where you're sitting, or Fort Ord, due north of where you're sitting. And there are credible stories about the Panthers being able to obtain arms from these military encampments. Then, of course, prisons are a recruiting ground as well for the Panthers in particular. And as suggested, many communists also had to do a stint in prison as well because of the Smith Act, the anti-communist trials. A leader that I focus on in these pages, Eldridge Cleaver, for example, was incarcerated variously in San Quentin and Folsom. Of course, he had roots in both Pasadena and Watts. Jonathan Jackson, as noted, had roots in Pasadena. So campuses, prisons, military encampments, and also factories have a role with regard to the rise of the Black Panther Party. And as you suggested a moment or two ago, with regard to funding concerning both the Communist Party and the Black Panther Party, not to mention the NAACP, they were receiving substantial funding from Hollywood during the time of the Communist Party, from screenwriters like Dalton Trumbo, who wrote the screenplay of Spartacus, for example, John Howard Lawson, a founder of the Union of Screenwriters, who wrote the screenplay to Sahara in the 1940s. And then by the time of the Panthers, we're talking about Marlon Brando, Jane Fonda, Gene Seberg, et al.
Yeah, you talk about the Smith Act and the influence of course, of the Communist Party in the book, and you talk about the place of Hollywood. Gil Scott Heron's B movie was the first time I ever heard the name Dalton Trumbo. And he talked about Ronald Reagan, the governor of California. Here in Los Angeles, I'm sure you're aware, we have the Southern California Library for Social Studies and Research, which is a repository of leftist literature and other artifacts. One of the largest intact concentrations of the Black Panther Party newspaper are at the Southern California Library. The works, papers, etc. of Charlotta Bass of the California Eagle are at the Southern California Library. Mike Davis, late historian, did a lot of his research at the Southern California Library. And it was started by a man named Emil Fried, who basically, during the time of the McCarthyism, so many people in Hollywood were ditching their pamphlets and other artifacts because they didn't want to be caught with them. And Emil Fried understood that this was history that needed to be preserved. So he would have all these boxes in his garage and eventually found a location to establish the Southern California Library for Social Studies and Research that we have today. So I was hoping you just did it, but if you could give us a little bit more about Dalton Trumbo. As I said, that was the first time I had ever heard of the name, was because of Gil Scott Heron.
Well, he was a talented writer. I mentioned Spartacus. Also, you may be familiar with the film featuring the now disgraced Woody Allen, The Front, which talks about how during the Red Scare, you had communist screenwriters like Dalton Trumbo, who were, quote, blacklisted, unquote, who were able to get their work produced by using a front, like a nebbish character as portrayed in this film, like Woody Allen. But he was one amongst a number of communist and or radical screenwriters. You may be familiar with the film, which I highly recommend to this very day, in addition to Spartacus, which is Executive Action. It comes out shortly after the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Providing the story is another Panther supporter, Donald Fried, a major funder of the Panthers. And the story is quite gripping in terms of portraying the diabolical forces behind the assassination of a US president. Dalton Trumbo also played a role in the trial of Angela Davis, for example, at a fraught moment when the prosecution was seeking to suggest that her undisguised love and affection for George Jackson provided the motive for capital charges of murder, kidnapping, etc., of a judge. Dalton Trumbo was recruited and provided to the lawyers a story that helped to convince the jury that there can be a distinction drawn between the love of an individual and engaging in capital crimes, for example, to see that individual is free. So he is an unsung hero of our struggle. He is an unsung hero of the Southland.
Okay, thank you for that. Now, I was apologizing to you earlier. I need to let the remixers know that I may have, I'm hopefully I didn't, but I think I told Professor Horne 15 minutes, which I did not mean to do. I was hoping he could stay here at least 30, and we're at 29 minutes now. I had two more questions I wanted to ask. And if there was possibly any questions from members of the chat. So I don't know how I'm gonna make this up to you. Maybe I'll take you to dinner, get you a Pan-African Film Festival pass. I don't know how I'm gonna make this up to you, but I would appreciate if you could hang just a little bit longer.
Sure, we can go to the 30-minute mark.
Well, it's 3:30 now, so maybe 15 more minutes.
Well, ask your questions and let's see what happens in the chat, and let's see what happens. I mean, let's not lock ourselves in if it may not be necessary.
All righty. So there's a book that I highly recommend to people called Reluctant Reformers, written by Robert L. Allen. As you probably are aware, he passed away in July of this year. Reluctant Reformers explores the centrality of racism to American politics through the origins, internal dynamics, and leadership of the major democratic and social justice movements between the early 19th century and the end of World War II. It focuses in particular on the abolitionists, the Populist Party, the Progressive Reformers, the women's suffrage, labor, and socialist and communist movements. Despite their achievements, virtually all these predominantly white movements failed to oppose, capitulated to, or even advocated racism at critical junctions in their history, with their efforts undercut by their inability to build and sustain a mass movement of both Black and white Americans. So I wanted to ask your opinion regarding Robert L. Allen's thesis regarding communist and white racism, and also his thesis of domestic colonialism being the condition of Black people currently in the U.S.
Well, as you may know, I've done a series of books dealing with settler colonialism in the United States, going back to the first settlements in what the Londoners call North Carolina in the 1580s. And one of the points that I bring forth, which is also reflected in the book at hand, is the fact that there's been a basic dichotomy within settler colonialism between, on the one hand, the settlers who come from various class backgrounds, but are bent upon expropriating the land of the indigenous, and with a little bit of luck and a lot of pluck, enslaving Africans to work for free so that they can achieve the so-called American dream by becoming wealthy. On the other hand, you have an enslaved population, which, as the Haitian Revolution suggests, inherently is involved in class struggle. And the descendants of the settlers and the descendants of the enslaved still have problems finding a meeting point because of that basic dichotomy, which you are suggesting Robert Allen talks about in terms of racism infecting organizations. But I would argue that it goes back to settler colonialism and how it is constructed. And this also ties into arguments that are in the book at hand with regard to the prospects for fascism on these shores. The point that I try to bring forth is that, again, there is a dichotomy because the enslaved, then the descendants of the enslaved, were subjected to fascist-like conditions, not least in prisons, but up to this very day. How can you describe what befell Sonia Massey in Illinois without reference to fascist-like tactics? For those who may not be familiar, she was shot on camera by a cop. Now, with regard to non-enslaved populations, oftentimes the operative concept was so-called bourgeois democracy. But this was not necessarily the concept that was operative amongst the descendants of the enslaved. And then there's a further point, which I say repeatedly in these pages, which is that 1865, slavery is abolished. But unlike in the British Empire, unlike France with regard to Haiti, where there were so-called reparations paid to the enslaving class, in London, of course, their descendants were being paid off as late as the 21st century. Mm-hmm. The enslaving class in North America was expropriated. Their property, the most valuable investment, was expropriated without compensation, leaving them furious, leading to the rise of the Ku Klux Klan and terrorist organizations. And then when you have the initiation of the socialist project in the 20th century, which many come to associate it, perhaps justifiably, with expropriation of private property, witness Cuba, for example, amongst others, the socialist comes to be associated with figures like Paul Robeson, for example, the late great actor, activist, concert singer, linguist, etc., which then turbocharges anti-Black racism because it's then infused with this other potent concept, which is anti-communism. So those are some of my attempted contributions to this conversation that Robert Allen contributed to.
Okay, thank you so much. Greatly appreciate that. Let me get to my quote unquote last question. So according to the book, you write that in October 1971, Kathleen Cleaver announces the formation of the Afro-American Liberation Army founded by her husband, Eldridge Cleaver. Earlier in the book, I recalled, I could be wrong, but I recalled a sentence saying that Huey Newton said that armed struggle should be the path forward at this particular juncture. He was either saying that in 69, 70, 71. But popular history tells us that the Southern California chapter, the entire chapter, was kicked out of the Panther Party by Huey Newton because he said, quote unquote, they were too violent. You talk about in the book, and I've heard elsewhere, where the Panther Underground was first organized by Bunchy Carter, that essentially the Southern California chapter was the underground. Can you help me out here? What am I missing? Is it my interpretation that's wrong, or?
Well, I'm not sure I understand the question, but the fact is that there were ups and downs with regard to armed struggle, with regard to relationship between Northern and Southern California. As a matter of fact, one of the sub-themes of this book is the relationship between North and South. You had a similar sort of conflict in the Communist Party, because given so-called Anglo settlement post the U.S. takeover of the Golden State circa 1850, the settlements were more populous in the 19th century in the Bay Area, particularly San Francisco. But at a certain point during the 20th century, population mushrooms in the Southland, along with funding, along with political strength. You even have this issue today. Have you noticed, I'm sure, that a number of the leading politicians in the Golden State, Nancy Pelosi, Gavin Newsom, Kamala Harris, they all have roots in San Francisco, for example. And so this introduces a certain kind of tension within the state, not only in the Communist Party, but in the Black Panther Party, et cetera. Now, another related problem, as you may have noticed, is that a central character in this book, because it focuses on the Southland, is Pasadena's Eldridge Cleaver, Watts' Eldridge Cleaver, who is a kind of mercurial character, let us say, euphemistically, that from his station in Algeria, he was counseling armed struggle. Those who were in North America oftentimes had differences with him. With regard to my own recollection, I recall being in Berkeley in the early 1970s when Huey Newton is being interviewed on television. Eldridge calls him up from Algeria and basically upbraids him. And of course, Eldridge had this idea that there was this left-right split within the party, with him on the left and Newton and his comrades on the right. This manifests itself with regard to the case that lasted for decades of the Panther from the Southland, once known as Elmer Geronimo Pratt, who had been charged with a crime, but apparently at the time was at a meeting up north, but had difficulty finding witnesses to corroborate that because of ideological differences.
Right.
Finally, he was freed, not least because of a mass movement and the legal wizardry of one Johnny Cochran, the late Johnny Cochran. So that's my response to the points that you raise.
Okay, I got you. So I saw one of your interviews, and you mentioned that this book is your attempt to assist us in avoiding the pitfalls of the past for those who may feel the need to pick up the gun in the future. Did I get that correct?
That's roughly accurate.
Mm-hmm. Because of the fraught political conditions that we currently find ourselves, not the least of which is this looming election with Donald Trump, there may be a need to pick up the gun again. Those are the questions that I had for you, sir. I see a lot going on over here in this chat, and I'm not even sure where the questions begin and where the comments end. So, is there anything else that you would like to get across that I did not ask you about?
Well, just to reiterate, this is a book that deals with internationalism, which I think is part of the missing ingredient in terms of the Black liberation struggle. As a matter of fact, I'm giving a talk in a few weeks at a university, and one of the points I'm going to mention is, one, I don't think that our movement has done a good job of analyzing cases like that of Sonia Massey. That is to say, bringing forth the historical roots of settler colonialism, the dichotomy between class struggle and class collaboration, the anti-Blackness that's part, I'm afraid to say, of this concept of whiteness and the construction of whiteness, et cetera. And then due west of Sonia Massey's hometown in St. Louis, you saw that the Zionist lobby was able to pick off Cori Bush. And I don't think that our movement has done a good job with regard to engaging internationalism. It has been intermittent. It has not been consistent. I mean, for example, as we speak, the world is aflutter about the rise of China, for example. That is a sub-theme of this book, for example. And yet, there's hardly a discourse in our movement, in the Black movement, that is, with regard to the rise of China. There's hardly a discourse with regard to what's happening concerning the alliance of Sahel states, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger. I mean, the list is endless. I'm going to mention in this talk that there's a lot of talk about global white supremacy, but when a leader, Prime Minister Meloni of Italy, shows up in the Oval Office last year, about this time, there's hardly a peep. I mean, even though she was embraced literally and figuratively by the US president, and despite her shameful and disgusting treatment of Black people in her country. So this book, as your comment suggested, is trying to provide helpful hints, shall we say, with regard to how to advance our movement and our struggle going forward in the 21st century.
First question I see is regarding the title and the question mark of your book. Can't get the book in the UK yet. They're asking why the question mark after armed struggle.
The question mark because it is a question, I mean, basically. And as I suggested, it's only a framing device. I put the question mark also there to try to signal, as I do in opening pages, that every sentence in this book is not about armed struggle. Right. And that the question mark is also meant to underline another point, which is that if in the future it is seen necessary to pick up the gun, I would hope that the comrades would do a political assessment of the battlefield, would seek to ensure that there's a rear base. The Black Panther Party, at least Eldridge Cleaver more particularly, had fraught relations with Cuba, which was not very strategic nor diplomatic. I would hope that they would realize that simply because there are Black people in North America who are subjected to fascist-like conditions, that does not necessarily mean that the entire nation is ready to overthrow the status quo. As I suggest, the election of figures like Reagan and Nixon, it was not happenstance. It was not accidental. Unlike some of our friends on the left, I do not necessarily see the descendants of settlers as being disguised social democrats yearning to breathe free. I argue that if, as happened in Louisiana in 1991, when 55% of the Euro-Americans voted across class lines for Nazi and Klansman David Duke, that should not be seen as accidental or coincidental. And if you take that point of view, then that should shape your strategy and tactics regarding the viability or the lack thereof of picking up the gun. Now, with regard to availability in the UK, I've received a number of inquiries with regard to that, and the publisher suggests that when you deal with Amazon, this is capitalism after all, they appropriate a chunk of what the reader lays down to get the book. And so the publisher suggested that they're trying to avoid that. However, if you write the publisher directly, as I've recommended to a number of people in the UK, I'm sure that you can work out an arrangement.
Okay. Professor Gerald Horne, Moore's Professor of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. I apologize profusely for any mix-ups on my part. Thank you so much for being on Rootwork today. Thank you so much for giving of your time, and thank you so much for your service to liberation struggles. Appreciate it.
Thank you for inviting me.
All right, you take care, sir.
Good luck.
So I didn't see a whole lot of questions. I guess y'all already got the information. Hopefully I can do some editing of that long stretch of me being on mute, make this more presentable. But also wanted to remind you all to check out the Black Liberation Media website, where you will see the open letter where we are asking people to support us financially on Patreon. And of course, you've got various Cash App, Venmo, donation links abroad. As you know, there used to be a time where you didn't have to pay for your video fare. You didn't have to pay for news analysis, etc. It came on network television, and it was paid for by advertising. And with the rise of the internet and cable and streaming, that whole business model has been turned upside down. We come to you directly and appeal to you to support us. So please do so at Cash App. Please do so at Venmo. Please support us at Patreon. Continue to watch us here on YouTube, but YouTube is real ugly right now and has demonetized us permanently because of the actions of an unscrupulous few, probably only an unscrupulous one. But at any rate, continue to like, share, subscribe, continue to support us financially, and continue to bear with me, personally, me for whatever reason, me and technology, we ain't got a thing going on, and I'm not quite sure what that's about. I would prefer to provide to you not just information, but information in a quality manner without all this madness. I'm doing the best I can, y'all. I appreciate y'all hanging with me and tuning in. Continue, like, subscribe, share. All right, I'm gonna get out of here. I don't even have Mr. Arthritis knocking on the door today, but had to let Professor Horne go. So at any rate, as per usual, appreciate y'all. Until next time, peace.